Great Scott, you guys. It has been 35 years since the second installment in one of the most beloved trilogies of all time, Back to the Future Part 2, directed by the great Robert Zemeckis, and co-written by our guest this week, the wonderful Bob Gale. My name's Al Horner, this is Script Apart, and today I'm delighted to have Bob back with us for the second time. Those of you who've been listening for a while might remember his first appearance in 2021, breaking down his first draft of 1985's iconic debut outing for Marty McFly and eccentric scientist Doc Brown. You may remember that episode detailing how Bob's original vision for the first Back to the Future was wildly different. Doc Brown had a pet chimp, because why not, and the film featured a huge nuclear explosion. Part 2 similarly went through multiple iterations, with the film initially expected to include a third act set in the 1960s. Instead, Bob landed on a story full of darkness that broke from the optimism of the first film to depict a murky future, one that in many ways we may have come to inherit a tiny bit. In the conversation you're about to hear, you'll discover what drew Bob to that darkness, the secret to Back to the Future's longevity, and which of Part 2's many predictions he's surprised to have seen come to pass in real life. Thanks to Bob once again for being a fantastic guest, and a massive thank you also to our Patreon supporters as ever. If you like what we do on Script Apart and you want to help support the show, patreon.com/scriptapart is the place to do it. For the price of a monthly cup of coffee, you'll get ad-free episodes, early access to episodes, the chance to ask your questions to upcoming guests, and for those of you who are writers out there, the chance to join our weekly writing hour, in which listeners get together with me on Zoom for an hour every Friday to crank out some pages and start the weekend the right way. It's been a lot of fun getting to know some of you guys, and we would love to have you on the next writing hour. To do so, join that Patreon community. That address one more time is patreon.com/scriptapart. Okay, that's all the admin out of the way. How about we hop in our proverbial DeLoreans, guys, and just get straight to it. This is the fantastic Bob Gale talking about the first draft secrets of Back to the Future Part 2. Thanks again everyone for tuning in. You're listening to Script Apart, hosted by me, Al Horner, and produced by Camille Demek. Bob Gale, welcome back to Script Apart. How are you today?
I'm great, Al. Thank you. Thank you for having me back. I guess I didn't mess up too badly the last time you had me on. So you say, well, all right, we'll give the guy another chance. Maybe he'll shoot himself in the head somehow.
No, you did a fantastic job. In fact, our inbox has been full for the last 2 years of requests for a round 2. So you're making a lot of listeners very happy today. Thank you so much for coming back. The last time we did speak, Bob, you were deep in the weeds with the Back to the Future musical as it kind of began its route to world domination. You've since expanded that show from Manchester and London to Broadway and a North American tour. Tokyo is next, I believe, which sounds like an amazing excuse to spend some time in Japan.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Have the years since we last spoke, Bob, kind of witnessing the international appetite for the musical, has that kind of reminded you of what a special story Back to the Future is all over again? Talk me through how your relationship with the franchise might have changed or been supercharged as a result of this process with the musical over the last few years.
It is, um, I pinch myself every day. I This is a future I never would have predicted, right? Um, it's it's so gratifying to see the power that this story has, and to go to the theater and see the show with 1,000, 1,500 people, even more on the tour, and they're all having the best time, including young people who've never seen the movie before. And the, what people forget, even people that have seen the movie before but only have seen it at home, um, they don't know what the communal experience of a comedy, of a great comedy, is like, to be in an audience where people are laughing and applauding. And it's it's just it's a tremendous adrenaline rush for me.
I can only imagine, yeah. As you've kind of ported the show from location to location, have you had to adjust it? I'm curious, for example, whether like prepping the Tokyo version of it like required any tweaks.
Well, sure. Yeah. Yeah. Um, for example, Japan is a lot more racially homogenous than America or the UK is. So uh, the idea that there would be a black janitor who becomes the mayor, um, we're not going to get a Japanese actor that's going to be doing that, and it um, so we changed that to that he's a high school dropout becomes a mayor, and it works just the same. It's a low class guy who rises up, and that stuff is all going to work. And then, of course, there are I've worked with the translator to make sure that certain uh, certain verbal jokes, like you are my density, um, the words density and destiny obviously are not going to be similar in Japanese, so they had to come up with something that was going to work for that. And they had a head start, of course, because the movie was dubbed into Japanese and also subtitled. So they used that as sort of the baseline. Say, okay, what do they do in those translations? Because that's what the audience is used to hearing, uh, some of that dialogue. But it turns out there were two or three dubs and I think two different subtitle versions, because um, every distributor that releases it, they do their own version of it. So uh, I can't wait to go there and see how this plays out. It's going to be great.
Oh, it's going to be brilliant. So yeah, we are talking today, Bob, to celebrate the upcoming 35th anniversary of Part Two.
Yes, we are.
When we spoke in 2021, Bob, I asked you about like the enduring appeal of the original film, and you put it down to this almost cosmic existentialist idea of who hasn't wondered about like what their parents did on their first date, and who hasn't wondered who their parents were versus who they are now, and the rhymes, the kind of echoes with what they might have been like at your age. Part two has equal staying power. Like in fact, it's possibly even more relevant, more discussed today because of, well, sadly, the degree to which our reality sometimes feels a bit closer to Hell Valley than Hill Valley, to quote that piece of graffiti from the film. What do you put that down to? What are we talking about when we talk about like the longevity and the incredible shelf life of part two?
Well, the first key aspect, and this was the question that Bob Zemeckis and I asked each other when we embarked on doing a sequel. We'd never done a sequel before. What is it that people want to see in a sequel? Well, they want to see the same movie, but they want to see it different, which doesn't really, yeah, I mean, that's what they want. But key to that is the characters. They want to see the characters that they loved so much. So before we even started writing the thing, uh, we said to the studio, okay, and the studio, at first we weren't sure we even wanted to do a sequel. And Universal said to us, gentlemen, um, there is going to be a Back to the Future Part Two, and you can be on the bus or off the bus. But we are making Back to the Future Part Two. And Bob and I said about that, what we also said about the musical. All right, if somebody is going to screw up a Back to the Future project, it better be us, because otherwise we'll just be kicking ourselves for the rest of our lives. Why didn't we jump in there and do this? So we decided, yeah, okay, we're going to do it. And the first thing we did was we told the studio, look, if we don't have Michael J. Fox and Christopher Lloyd, we don't have a movie. We will not do it without them. And the studio said, you're right. If we don't get them, there shouldn't be a Back to the Future Part Two. So interestingly enough, um, the CEO of Universal, MCA, Sid Sheinberg, who was the guy we had dealt with on the first movie. He went and made deals for with Christopher Lloyd and Michael J. Fox, not only for Back to the Future Part Two, but for Back to the Future Part Three. And we're like, whoa, 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 we're getting ahead of ourselves here. But he said, I just want to make those deals. I'm going to make those deals now while I can make them before their price goes up again. So he did that. And then we said, okay, let's see if Leah Thompson wants to be in it. And we called up Leah and we said, hey, we got Michael and Chris. Bob and I are doing a show. You want to be involved? She said, absolutely. You guys are doing it? Absolutely. And we went to Tom Wilson, played Biff. Same thing. He said the same thing. And we went to Crispin Glover, and Crispin was not so sure, and he asked for a lot more money than we thought was appropriate. So his agent thought it was more than he should have been asking for, but the client gets to decide whether they will do a movie for X amount of dollars. And so when he wouldn't lower his price, we said, okay, that's fine. We will make Back to the Future Part Two without Crispin Glover. And that fact, it was that fact that was one of the instigating factors of making George McFly a tombstone in Hell Valley in 1985A. We don't have him, so let's make that into a story point. Where's George McFly? He's dead. Biff killed him. How did Biff kill him? Why? So the whole idea about the fantasy of what you would do if you had the ability to travel through time, everybody says the same thing. Oh, gee, I'd go and I'd buy stock in Apple, right?
Yeah.
I'd buy stock in Apple when nobody was buying stock in Apple, and then I'd come back to the future and I'd be a gajillionaire. So I'd find out who won all these sports games, and I'd wager on them. So these were these aren't new ideas; they're not original ideas. People have had these ideas before, and but they're very human. This way, okay, you're going to use in Back to the Future, the first movie, Marty time travels accidentally, and the fix that he gets into is completely by accident, and all he is trying to do is make sure that he's born. He just wants to. If he went back to 1985 and it was exactly the way he left it, he would be a happy camper. Turns out that because of what he does, he comes back to a 1985 that's better than the one that he left because he did good things while he was back there. Well, this is kind of the flip side of that. It's like, okay, I'm in the future, and as Marty says, yeah, Doc, I get all that stuff, but what's wrong with making a few bucks on the side? And the traditional dramatic thing is when you use power selfishly, it backfires on you. And sure enough, it backfired. And then he's got to straighten it all out. And then they make the Harry Potter play, and they use the same story.
That description you just used, Bob, is really interesting of this film as the same but different, to the point where, well, it almost feels like a piece of commentary on the act of sequel making. There are overlaps with the first film.
Yes.
We're literally going back to scenes from the original and replaying them from different angles, but beneath those overlaps are these quite wild departures in places. And I think the most obvious of which is the darkness of part two, Bob. Like, this film definitely traded in some of the sunniness of the first for something a little bit murkier. Can I ask what drew you to that darkness? Like, this is a film that shows how easily society and how easily America can slip into cultures of garishness and greed and decline. Where did all that come from?
Well, we were certainly inspired by Frank Capra's movie It's a Wonderful Life. Um, the whole Potterville thing in there. What would have happened if George Bailey had never been born? Um, so that was certainly quite upfront in our consciousness. Say, okay, here's a model of a story that does this. Um, on a certain level, Christmas Carol does that. If Scrooge finds out if he remains on the path that he's on, you know, Tiny Tim is going to be a tombstone. So I said these are classic human themes, and we did. I did write a version of Back to the Future Part Two that you can find online. That we put it out there, where instead of going back to 1955, they go back to 1967, and we do a whole thing about the hippie movement, and Lorraine is a flower child, and George is a professor at San Francisco State University, and this time Marty has to make sure that his parents end up in the hotel room where he was conceived. Um, but that version of the script, it was a lot of fun, but we decided it was a little bit too on the nose. It was too much of a remake of the first movie. And it was Bob Zemeckis who came up with the idea of saying, let's go back into the first movie and look at it from a different point of view. Again, an idea that turns out to be so good that they ripped it off in the Avengers,
Yeah.
in one of the Avengers sequels, right? They have to go back into the first couple of movies to find the Power Stones.
At least they credit you in that. Um,
Yeah, they do actually. They do. That was hilarious that they did that. Yeah.
it is a different the dystopia that we see in the film is a different sort of dystopia to the one that we're used to seeing, Bob. And you describe in the DVD commentary for the film trying to create a future where what's wrong is due to who lives in the future as opposed to the technology. Can you talk to me about that? What did you mean by that phrase?
We've seen a lot of movies about dystopian futures, and Blade Runner is a great example of it. And I'm not, don't get me wrong, I do not denigrate Blade Runner. I love Blade Runner. I think it's one of the greatest science fiction movies ever made. But the thing about Blade Runner, and the thing about so many other movies about the future, set in the future, is it looks like they tore down everything. They tore down the entire past. And Blade Runner tells us that we're in Los Angeles 2020 or 2025, whenever that is. And there is absolutely nothing in Blade Runner that looks like Los Angeles. Now, in reality, if you were to time travel in London, or time travel in New York, or time travel in London or Los Angeles, any place, we don't tear down the past. We build around it. We refurbish it. Sometimes we tear it down. But if you were to go to London, if you were from 1950 in London, and you traveled to present day London, yeah, you'd be blown away by some of the things that you were seeing, but the streets are all the same. They go to the same places. The tube stations are all the same. You get in the tube and you can go to Charing Cross, you can go to Covent Garden, you can go wherever you're going. Kew Gardens is still Kew Gardens, right? All the Museum of Natural History is still there. Um, those things didn't change. And we don't do that in human beings don't do that. We can't afford it, of course, even if we wanted to. So one of the things that was really important for us is that when you go to Hill Valley 2015, You recognize it. Yeah, there's the courthouse. They turned it into a shopping mall, but it's the same building. We recognize it. We recognize that there's a there's the town square, and interestingly, we looked at what the trends were in urban development, and we said, okay, in 1955, it was it was a park area and war memorial. They paved it over in the by the time we got to 1985, as the Joni Mitchell song, they paved Paradise and put in a parking lot. And then they took the parking lot out and they turned it into a pond in a park again. So, and that was the environmental trends that were going on uh, when we made the movie. And we said, yeah, this seems like an accurate prediction of the future. Now, one prediction of the future, there are many predictions of the future that we made that interestingly came true or close to true. One of them that we knew was never going to happen was flying cars. We promised you flying cars at the end of the first movie. And the whole flying car thing, as I've mentioned before, um, that came about based on a documentary I saw when I was 9 years old in 1960. I saw a documentary about the wonderful world of 1985. They were predicting what the future was going to be like, and they had flying cars. And yeah, I was always frustrated that we never got flying cars. So I said, we're putting a flying car in Back to the Future, and then we wanted to run with that ball, and of course, some of the little, just like the first movie, the second movie is full of all kinds of little details. So if you look carefully on the town square, there is a no landing zone uh, on the street. You see a hovering car with a circle and a slash through it. Can't land here. And you know, if you look at the if you freeze frame on the USA Today, I think there's a story on the sidebar that says "Man killed by falling litter," because people are going to throw stuff out of their flying car, and somebody's going to get killed. Somebody's going to get killed that way. So were all kinds of things that we thought, okay, we really did have flying cars. What are some of the social problems that would exist? You know, and as a side note, I today I say, you know, people have enough trouble driving in 2 dimensions. It's probably good that they're not driving in three.
Continuing our kind of like topic of the departures that this film makes compared to the first, it's a movie that kind of dared to show its protagonist, Marty, as kind of more fallible than we'd seen him before, more flawed. So
Yes.
the Marty of part two, he kind of, well, he teeters on the edge of greed in the way that he wants to take the sports almanac back and use it for financial gain. He's also kind of petty and insecure, and he has this kind of like male ego.
Yeah, he's got this temper, you know. Nobody calls me chick. So the yeah. So the thing about drama that we learned at USC, and you can learn from all kinds of books, is that in the best dramas, a character makes a significant character change. Now, in the first movie, Marty is not a flawed character. He doesn't make a character change. It's George. George is the one who makes a character change. He's, he's weak and he's insecure, and he becomes a man. Marty teaches him to become a man, and he stands up to Biff, and he has a better future because of it. So when Bob and I were struggling with the story of Back to the Future Part Two, we realized that we needed to give Marty a flaw. And people often say to me, well, okay, if you we're going to go back and, redo the first movie, is there anything that you would change or add? And what we would probably do is lay a little bit of groundwork for the nobody calls me chicken thing, because we just kind of, shoehorn that in there so that Marty would have a journey to go through, and the drag race that he has in um, in 1985 that ruins his life, as we learn in 2015. The lesson that he learns through part two and part three is that you just don't take the bait when somebody calls you chicken. You don't, you just don't do that. When Biff calls him out on the street for the gunfight, he doesn't take the bait. We're getting into the other movie right now, and we'll talk about that more in detail next year, I'm sure. But yeah, that's so we had to give Marty a darker place to start from so that he could grow. And then there's the revelation when Marty finds out that his father's dead in and Doc is committed and that Biff stole the almanac. And there's that scene where Marty says, "Son of a bitch stole my idea." And then he goes, "It's my fault. It's all my fault." And, he has the epiphany at that point, and he realizes that, you know, just going for pure naked greed, um, there's consequence to that. And now he's got to clean up the mess that he made.
Yeah, and what I love about that, Bob, is, you know, the fact that Marty is fallible here, the fact that, this film explores the possibility that the hero of the first movie that everyone embraced, that everyone kind of like saw as this paragon of goodness, he could end up a bit of a loser, and his kids, in fact, could end up bad people too. That all kind of ties into this broader message that I think the Back to the Future trilogy seems to build towards, about kind of like the fact that the future is in our own hands. Nothing is owed to us by destiny. We have to be diligent in like our decision making every day to kind of like earn the right future, to earn a good future. Did you have that message in mind as you kind of like talked about what to do with Marty this time around to better emphasize that idea? Like, it seems very purposeful what you're doing with that character here and how you are merging him with this kind of more complicated idea around fate that you're introducing.
Absolutely. Absolutely, because that's the theme of the first movie. And it just made sense that we needed to continue that theme to say, okay, this is a family saga. This is the saga of the McFly family. It's also the saga of the town of Hill Valley. And, it's the story of Doc Brown and the decisions that he makes. But by and large, it is the McFly family saga. And we learn even more of the history of the McFly family when we get to part three. And this was all done by design. It was all to say, yeah, okay, these are things. The family is obviously everybody's baseline. It's everybody's core. Unless you're an orphan and you don't have a family. But for the vast majority, and even if you're an orphan and you're adopted, your adopted family becomes your family. And um, this is the baseline of what happens to you is what you learn. And, we hear all these stories about, okay, people who were abused as children, they often end up becoming just like their father, and they become abusers. And these cycles can repeat. And we wanted to say, hey, the cycle doesn't have to repeat. We should be able to learn from our past, from our history, from the things that we do, and think about those things and to say, yeah, one small thing that we do or don't do can have serious, serious effect on and we don't know what. We don't know what. There's a story about a guy, I think his last name is Hines, Hines. And you can find he's got a video on YouTube, maybe more than one. This guy I don't know, 15, 20 years ago. He he's bipolar, and he decided that he had nothing to live for, and he was gonna jump. He's commit suicide by jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge, and he wrote a note, and he said, "This is why I'm doing this." He didn't know he's bipolar, but he said, "I'm depressed. I got nothing to live for. Nobody notices me. Nobody cares about me. But I won't do this if, while I'm walking to the Golden Gate Bridge, somebody smiles at me and really acknowledges me as a human being." Well, nobody did. Now he jumps off the Golden Gate Bridge, but he survives. And because he survives, he thinks to himself, you know what? I've got a story to tell, and I need to be telling this story to people. So the fact that you say hello or you smile to somebody that you pass on the street, that might save their life. You don't know. Um, I mean, I'm getting into some esoteric stuff here, but I mean, these are the type of things that we think about when we start into this rabbit hole to say, we don't know what these little things are. George falls out of a tree in the first movie, and it ends up how he meets Lorraine. And all these little things can happen. And sometimes they're little things, and sometimes they are big things. And we don't know at the time what the effect that they're going to have will be. When I was a kid, growing up in my neighborhood, um, they had a tree planting, not a ceremony, a program. They were encouraging everybody to plant saplings in front of their house. And in 20 or 30 years, we'd have these big, massive trees, which in my neighborhood, yeah, those trees grew up, made the street beautiful. I also sometimes I wonder, what if somebody crashed their car into one of those trees and they got killed? You know, did the tree that my family planted, did it kill somebody? You never know.
You mentioned a moment ago, Bob, the phrase you used was when Robert Zemeckis and I were struggling with part two. I can imagine the pressure being immense following up like a success of the magnitude of the first film. The experience of writing a sequel must have been a very different experience to penning the original because of that expectation that was now on part two. What did it look like? Like, was it kind of agonizing? Was there a pressure on your shoulders?
Oh my God, the pressure was intense. And one of the reasons, there were three reasons. First of all, we're making a sequel from, the most popular movie of 1985. Possibly one of the most popular movies of the 1980s. So we had huge shoes to fill. We also made a movie that said the future can be changed. And so, Bob and I would spitball sometimes and say, okay, what if Marty says to Jennifer in the opening of the movie, you know what, Jennifer, I'm breaking up with you. We're not going to get married. Uh, we won't have kids. Doc, does that solve the problem? Well, we could do that, but the audience would they'd be really mad at us if that's what we did. We
Yeah.
promised that we were going into the future. We had to go to the future. We had to see Marty's kids. We had to see that something had to be done about we had to pay that off. So what we intended as a joke at the end of part one, because lots of times people say to me, "Oh, you guys must have surely known you were going to do a sequel." No, we had absolutely no idea that anybody was even going to see Back to the Future Part One. And as Bob Zemeckis has said on numerous occasions, if we knew we were going to do Back to the Future Part Two, we would have never put Jennifer in the car,
Yeah.
because when we got to the future, we said, "What are we going to do with Jennifer? She's not really a very well developed character. Yeah, she's Marty's better nature, but what are we going to do?" So we said, "Well, let's let's have her be unconscious. Let's have her be unconscious for most of the picture." Uh, and yeah, it's kind of a cheap cheap way out. But then, okay, the police find her, they take her home, and then we make something out of that too. But it was one of these things where, all right, we painted ourselves into these various corners. How do we get out of them? And we have to do it with finesse and with creativity and in a way that the audience will say, okay, all right, I'll buy that. I'll go with that.
Yeah, it's really impressive how you managed to kind of find your way out of the corners that you painted yourself into at the end of part one quite so seamlessly. Um, when it came to, sitting down and writing this thing, when, it had been apparent that like part one's a massive hit, we have to do a sequel. What are we going to do? I can imagine it feeling quite daunting because time travel allows so many different avenues. Like these guys have a time machine. You could go to any period. I'm curious whether like it crossed your mind even for a moment to go to ancient Rome or to see the dinosaurs. Were there other periods, Bob, that you were looking into, or was it always roughly this time period?
The thing that we always knew was that it had to center on family. There was no possibility that we were going to go back to the Stone Age. Um, Besides, the time circuits didn't go back that far. They didn't have a BC in on the time displays. We could go back to the year zero, and that was about it. But nevertheless, we for a while we thought, wouldn't it be fun to go to the Roaring Twenties, because that was the gangster period. Um, Bob and I loved all those great old Cagney and Bogart gangster movies, Prohibition. We'd actually written a Prohibition action story at one point, and wouldn't it be fun to go back there and meet Doc Brown's mother, and then find out that Biff's ancestor was a bootlegger king of Hill Valley, and George's ancestor was the bookkeeper for the Tannen crime family. Um, for whatever reason, we decided not to do that. But when we made the Telltale video game in 2011, we used that. And so, for those of you that are the total fanatics and want to either track down that video game, or you can track down the IDW comic book series called Citizen Brown, which is the graphic novel version of that video game. And we deal with a lot of that stuff that could have been in Back to the Future Part 2.
The scenes in the future are so fascinating, Bob, and like you say, that's what you had promised to the audience, and that's what you had to deliver on. I'm really curious about how you kind of thought up all the things that would feature in these future scenes, and well, I guess like also how you managed to get so many of them right, because well, to start to go through some of them like one by one, like you kind of predicted the franchiseification of Hollywood. You have that moment where Marty steps into the future and he's attacked by a hologram advert for Jaws 19. So you predicted how we were heading down that rabbit hole of endless sequels. But that was originally meant to be Godzilla, right? In this sort of script that goes to the 60s in the end. Do I remember that being where the joke goes?
Possibly. Yeah, well, if they were in the 60s, um, it couldn't be Jaws. Um, but no, I think I would have to dig up some of those old drafts. Um, I I don't recall. Um, but yeah, I mean they'd already made. I think by the time we made Back to the Future Part 2, they'd already made Jaws 3D, and maybe Jaws. Yeah, they made Jaws 4, because it was the tagline for that was, "This time it's personal," and the tagline for Jaws 19 was, "This time it's really, really, really personal."
Hope producer Steven Spielberg enjoyed that one. Another thing, of course, that you managed to predict was there's this kind of 1980s cafe there that that kind of very much predicted the nostalgia for the 80s that we'd have by the time we reached the 2010s with shows like Stranger Things. I guess that's a good entryway into talking about like the kind of nuanced things that Back to the Future and Back to the Future Part 2 have to say about nostalgia. Like,
Well, let me say this. The that was one of the easiest predictions that we made, and that was one that we were 99% sure that we were going to get right because people are always nostalgic about their childhood. And you have to grow up to be an adult to be nostalgic about your childhood. So it's always 30 years in the past. So that was an easy one. Say, yeah, okay, 2015, they're going to be nostalgic about the 80s. Um, now we're nostalgic about the 90s, right? So it's easy. That's that one. That's just human nature. That was the ones that we were surprised about, like the drone, the USA Today drone, and comes down, takes the picture, and the dog walking drone. We just thought that was cool. And wow, we had no idea that that was going to be accurate.
how about the hoverboards? Like, that's one of the enduring images of the film. Like, how did they come to be, and what level of disappointment do you have that they are one of the few things that hasn't come to pass?
Huh. Um, yeah, it is pretty disappointing that we don't have those. Uh, and what's really annoying, what has been annoying to me is that they have these wheeled things that they call hoverboards, but they're not. They don't really hover. Uh, they came out with these things, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years ago. Called them hoverboards. They don't really hover. Um, we One of the things that we needed to do with the movie was to have fun with the first movie. So in every time period, we did things. So there's a dinner table scene in every time period in the trilogy. There's one in the 80s. There's one in the 50s in the first movie. We go to 2015. There's a dinner table scene, right? We go in the past in 1885. There's a dinner table scene. So there's a chase. There's a chase in the 50s. We got to do a chase. We do two chases in part two. And we did a skateboard chase. So what's the modern, what's going to be the futuristic equivalent of a skateboard? Hoverboard. Just let's take it. And when we get to the past, we can't do anything like that. So we just have Marty dragged around on a rope behind a horse. Uh, we're just thinking about, okay, what are the things that you would do in a particular time period to hit some of these nails on the head or to touch that button on a certain way to touch that area so that um, it would resonate. And of course, a lot of it had to do with the actual town of Hill Valley. Say, okay, what is Hill Valley going to look like in the future? And what does L Valley look like when Biff takes over and has way too much money? And that is okay. That makes sense. That is, let's go to Las Vegas and see what happens when people have more money than they have taste.
It's in the 1980s cafe that we get our first tease for the third movie. And like, I'm fascinated by what extra pressure that heaped on your shoulders, having to kind of essentially write the two films side by side, laying track in one for the film to come. Like, how are you kind of juggling these two sequels at the same time?
Well, we originally, before we had decided we were going to do a part three, we made a 165, 170-page version of Back to the Future Part Two, which included an Act Four, which was going back to the West. As Bob Zemeckis said, we got to go back to the West. And I said, yeah, we do need to do Western. So I wrote this version and it was extraordinarily expensive, but also it didn't work because suddenly, three-quarters of the way through the movie, we're introducing a whole bunch of new characters that we haven't seen or basically haven't heard of before. And that's not the way that you write a story. You don't want to introduce key characters. So the draft was too long and it didn't work. And I said to Bob Zemeckis, look, what's happening in Act Four, characters, these new characters that we've introduced, they don't really have a chance to breathe. They don't have a chance to be flushed out. I said, give me a week. And I did this. I forget whether this was over Thanksgiving 1987 or Christmas. Maybe it was, no, we started shooting in 88. So it was 87. So let me flush this out. Let me just write and write and write and let the characters tell me what they want to do. So I end up with a 210-page script, and it bisected exactly where Back to the Future 3 would begin. And I said, Bob, we need to make two movies. We need to make them back to back. And let's tell Universal that we have good news and we have bad news. And by the way, Bob Zemeckis was in the throes of making Who Framed Roger Rabbit at
That's
the time.
right. Yeah.
So I wasn't always getting a chance to spend as much time with him as I would have liked. So we went to Universal and we said, okay, we will not have Back to the Future Part 2 ready for you for the summer of 1989. And part of that was how much more complicated Roger Rabbit was. But we can have Back to the Future Part 2 in theaters for Thanksgiving of 1989 and have Back to the Future Part 3 in theaters for the summer of 1990. And Sid Sheinberg, the CEO of MCA, looked at us and told us we were out of our minds. Not the first time we'd been accused of that. And he said, I just want Back to the Future Part 2 as soon as you can give it to me. Well, I went and I shortened it as much as I could. And I had this 165-page script. I gave it to our production manager to budget. Budget turned out to be $55 million. Then I said to our production manager, I gave her the 210-page script. And I said, budget this as if it were two movies that we were going to shoot one right after the other. And tell me how much that's going to be. And that budget came out to be 70 or $71 million. So then we went back to Universal and we said, here's Back to the Future Part 2. It's 160 pages long and it's a $55 million movie. What? $55 million? We are not going to make the most expensive movie ever made. That's what Sheinberg told us. Okay. Yeah. We understand. You don't want to make a movie that costs that much money. And it would have been the most expensive movie ever made. And then I said, here is a budget for Back to the Future 2 and Back to the Future 3. And they are two movies that each cost $35 million. Does that sound a little bit more interesting to you? And yeah, that sounded a whole lot more interesting. Then he got it. Then he understood. So that's how Back to the Future 2 became Back to the Future 2 and 3. And by this point, we already knew what Back to the Future 3 was because it had been written. So setting stuff up, that was easy enough to do. You know, we have Biff in his hot tub and he's watching Fistful of Dollars. And that's a beautiful setup for the showdown in Back to the Future Part 3. So, and we do the wild gunman gag in Cafe 80s, um, which, by the way, was never really an arcade game at the time. Although I think after the movie came out, Nintendo may have made an arcade version of Wild Gunman. It's a home game. I played it a lot. uh, so yeah, so that's what we did.
It must have liberated you in some sense as soon as you were able to split the films into two, Bob, because presumably you no longer had the same pressure to serve both of your main characters, Doc and Marty. Part two is very much Marty's film, and Doc is allowed to kind of almost dip in and out of it, like in large part just showing up for kind of expository reasons or to kind of give Marty a task. And you could do so because part three is gonna be his film. Did that come as a giant relief as soon as you did opt to split the films into two?
Oh, absolutely. And the interesting thing about Back to the Future Part 3 is that Marty and Doc dramatically change places. Marty is the adult and Doc is the kid, you know? Marty has to keep saying, Doc, what's the right thing to do up here? He's trying to be the voice of science, the reason, and Doc is saying, I have to do what's in my heart. And it's just it's a beautiful reversal. And it really, it really just brings out the best in both of these characters.
Yeah. Love will make you break the space-time continuum. It happens.
Yeah.
I should ask as well about the ending of part two. So Marty burns the almanac. That kind of resets the changes to the timeline. Doc hovers above in the time machine, and then the DeLorean is struck by lightning and disappears. And it's at that point that a Western Union courier arrives, and he hands Marty a letter from Doc, who tells him that the lightning transported him into the past, 70 years into the past. He's in 1885. Tell me about this ending, that kind of letter being handed and the shock on that delivery man's face.
That's one of the greatest. It's one of my favorite things in Back to the Future Part Two is is that the Western Union guy just shows up right at that point because nobody sees anything coming here. And then when he explains it, you go, hell yeah, yeah, that's great. That really makes sense. I love that. I love that. Um, it's it is something that you can only do in in time travel. And since we've gotten to this point here, I need to talk about two things of the most frequently asked questions about Back to the Future 2 and 3, because when this goes up, somebody's going to put this in the comments, and now they won't because they watched the whole thing. So the DeLorean gets struck by lightning, and you see the two 99s in this fire trails 99. What does that mean? What does that mean? Well, what it means is that the car has to accelerate to 88 miles an hour to travel through time, but it accelerated by going around in a spiral. And the fire trails that it leaves are spirals, and that's why it's 99.
I see.
That's what that's all about. People don't always understand that, so there it is. The other thing, and it's more about Back to the Future Part 3, but people are still asking this question all the time. When Marty ends up in 1885, why don't they just go back to the mine and get the gasoline out of the DeLorean that Doc buried there? Well, there's two reasons why that was never going to happen. The most important reason is that if anybody out there knows anything about putting a car in long-term storage, you drain all the fluids out of the car. There was no gasoline in the car when Doc hit it in the mine. The other thing that Doc would have never done is he would have never risked unearthing the car and risking a time paradox. Because what if they pull the car out and they break something? What happens then? Doc would never want to go there. So those are two excellent reasons why That wasn't ever going to
I'm so glad we were able to put that to bed. Um,
happen.
Bob, I should ask as well about like, the reception to this movie. I can imagine like having made the departures that you did from the first film in terms of the darkness and in terms of that more complicated depiction of Marty, that like there was maybe a bit of nerves going into the film and its release. Like you didn't know how people were going to react based on the sort of changes.
Yeah, let me talk about that because it's people say if there's anything that you could do differently, um, what would it be? I got into a big argument with the head of the studio, Tom Pollock, about the release campaign for Back to the Future Part Two. I was adamant that it be promoted as the second part of the Back to the Future trilogy. Because at this time, way back then, when there was no internet, nobody knew there was going to be a third movie except for all of us who were working on it.
Yeah.
So I remembered going to see The Empire Strikes Back and being really upset at the end of that movie. Han Solo's in carbon freeze? What the heck kind of ending is that? That's not satisfying. So I was very concerned that the public was going to be upset when Doc Brown is presumably killed or something happens to him and the movie doesn't end. And it's why at the end of part two, there is a trailer for part three before we even run the end credits. It's a idea that we got from Richard Lester's The Three Musketeers in 1973. There was a trailer for The Four Musketeers at the very end of that movie. Two really terrific movies, the best English language version movies of The Three Musketeers ever made, in my opinion. And so we swiped that idea from there to say, okay, yeah, we know you're pissed off that um, that the movie's ending this way, but we got good news for you. There is going to be a Back to the Future Part 3. It's coming out next summer. And here's a good look at it. So that we hope that people would feel better than they felt when they left Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back. But I really wanted it to be part of the campaign so that when you bought your ticket, you knew that there was going to be a part three. But I got shut down. I wish I would have fought harder for that. I wish I would have tried to talk Steven into saying, yeah, we got to do that. But we didn't. And so people were really pissed off that in the day. That never happened again once the movies came out. Once the third movie was out and we released the movies on DVD in a box set, and everybody said, "Oh, okay, yeah, there's a third one. We already know that. It's okay." But for those, for those couple of weeks when the part two opened in November of 1989, people didn't have any clue. There were a lot of angry people leaving the movie theater saying, "How dare they not end that way?"
Wow, that's so interesting to sort of think of now because of course, I mean, we mentioned Avengers earlier. Like now it's almost kind of a requisite that films end on that sort of like note of to be continued. That's
Right.
that's mad to kind of think that people were angry. Did the anger kind of abate before part 3 or cuz this is a bit before my time. I only caught the films on DVD when I was a little bit, when I was old enough to. Yeah, how was the public reaction? When did it start to calm down?
It calmed down as the campaign for part three started to kick in, but nevertheless, I think there were people that were very upset and decided that they were done with the franchise because part three didn't do as well as part two did. Um, now of course people can see all three movies one right after the other, and they can see how well they dovetail into each other, and it's not it's not an issue anymore. And although sometimes when somebody says, "Yeah, my favorite of the movies is part three," some people get really upset. How can you like part three better than you like part two? And I say, you know what? Part two doesn't exist without part one, and part three doesn't exist without part two. So okay, the only movie that stands all by itself as a what some people consider to be a nearly perfect movie is the first one. Um, and we had to shoehorn some stuff into part two to make it work. But as a three movie trilogy, I think it works tremendously well, and I think the public agrees.
We should wrap up, Bob, because I've taken up so much of your time. But before we go, I'm curious, like, you're still in touch, I'm taking it, with the creative team that excelled so incredibly on this film. Do you speak often to
Oh
Robert
yeah,
and
yeah. Look, I'm constantly. I just had lunch with Bob Zemeckis on Sunday, as a matter of fact. Uh, I see Bob regularly. I talk to him more regularly. I email him even more regularly. So yeah, Bob and I are good close friends as it's always been. Um, I don't see Stephen quite so much, um, or Frank and Kathy, but some of the other people, Dean Cundy, the director of photography. Um, I'm in touch with David McGiffert, the first assistant director, cast, of course. Uh, I see I see Chris and Leah fairly often. Michael not quite as often because he lives in New York. Um, so yeah, there's a lot of us involved with the movies. Don Full Love, who played Goldie Wilson, and um, Harry Waters Jr., Marvin Berry, Huey Lewis, uh, and those guys, and a lot of everybody. The the musical has brought everybody back together. Because everybody wanted to go, oh my God, they did a musical. Got to, what do they do? How do they get it? Did they get it right? Did they get it right? Yeah, got it right.
I very much imagine when you and Robert get together, you're kind of doing so over a paper shredder into which you're kind of slowly filing all the requests constantly pouring in from studios and whoever else to make another Back to the Future. We talked about it last time, Bob. It is one of the remaining franchises that has refused to be rebooted or given the legacy sequel treatment or anything like that. Are the requests still pouring in, as I imagine? Are there any updates on that since we last spoke?
we People still do ask, are you guys ever going to do Back to the Future Part 4? Well, now, the answer is, do you want to see a Back to the Future movie without Michael J. Fox in it? People think and they say, well, no, not really. And then that puts that conversation to bed. But we knew creatively when we finished part three. Bob and I were two of the people who did not want to see the Beatles get back together because we felt like, okay, the Beatles had their time and it was great and it was fantastic. But if they got back together, the expectations would be so high they could never reach those expectations. So it's better to remember the Beatles and to celebrate what they did rather than to try to recreate the past and have it fail. And, we've seen this so many times with so many franchises where they go back one too many times. And it seems like the movies that are the best are the ones that are made in, reasonably close to when the original got made. And then sometimes if the original filmmakers do it, it's why is Die Hard 3 is better than Die Hard 2? Because McTiernan directed Die Hard 3 and he didn't direct Die Hard 2. And so I would put Die Hard 3 way up higher than Die Hard 2. Die Hard 4 and 5, let's not even talk about those. Um, but then, okay, we've got we've got the Indiana Jones movies, and Steven directed Indiana Jones Part 4, and we really don't want to talk about that either, do we?
Well, I'm so glad that like it's been able to sort of exist as its own perfect thing for so long, and yeah, I will absolutely take you up on the offer of reconvening next year to talk about part three, Bob, because this is a franchise that means so much to me. So it's been wonderful talking about this great film today and hearing all the updates on the musical. Listeners, if you haven't yet seen the musical, please do go out and see it. It's so much fun. And yeah, Bob, thank you so much for your time today. This has been an absolute blast.
Thanks, Al. It's been great talking to you, and I look forward to talking to you in I don't know, another 6 or 8 months about Back to the Future Part Three, because there are so many more stories to tell. We'll make it happen. Don't worry. I promise.
I really look forward to it. Thanks again so much, Bob. This has been such a delight.
You're welcome, Al. See you in the future.
You've been listening to Script Apart. Thank you so much for tuning in. A reminder that if you want to help the show continue to grow, you can join us on Patreon by visiting patreon.com/scriptapart or clicking the link in today's show notes. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time.